Amen. What a beautiful reminder that is. Thanks, Erin, for leading us. Thanks, Lynn and the team as well. We're going to jump into this passage in Mark today. So if you have your Bibles with you, I would love for you to open them up. If you don't, then share with someone next to you, or open them on your phone or iPad, whatever you do, or just sit and listen, allow the word to wash over you. Just one quick thing we didn't mention earlier is that we also, on Thursday night, had the privilege of welcoming in a number of new members. We're very excited about, and we're going to be sharing, we're going to be welcoming them in a couple of weeks and introducing them to you. But let's dive in. We're going to read from Mark chapter 7, verse 24, right through to chapter 8, verse 21, and we're going to skip over just the start of chapter 8. Okay, so read with me. It says, Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There were some people brought to him, a man who was deaf and who could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears, and then he spit, touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh, he said, Ephatha, Ephatha, which means be opened. Do you like how I said that? At this, the man's ears were opened. His tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. And then skipping down to verse 14, chapter 8, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves of the 4,000, which is the passage we just skipped, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He says to them, do you still not understand? Now, it's funny because as you read all of these stories, at first they can seem like totally disconnected, a bit random. And then you start to scratch the surface and we dig into them and we see this beautiful thread that reveals the wonder of God and how he, in his splendor and his sovereignty, ties all of these things together to paint for us a picture that often we don't initially see, but then begin to realize as we focus in on Jesus and who he is. And what is so cool about this passage is the way that Jesus does tie all of this together. And hopefully you see today that over all of these chapters that we've been speaking from, really since about chapter 4, when he suddenly starts speaking in parables, that Jesus has been doing this to work out who has eyes to see and ears to hear and who doesn't. And so this section flows directly on from that before it. We pick up really directly from JB's message last week, that basically what Jesus is saying last week in saying to the Pharisees is that ultimately traditions and religiosity won't save you. Because underlying all of our external behaviour, as Aaron's just talked about, there is this heart problem where we are sinful people, where we are all defiled and depraved, where we are wicked in like the not cool sense, like that's totally wicked, but the evil kind of sense, right? So this section flows on from this, and therefore the Pharisees, just like everyone else, are sinners in need of saving. And then this goes straight into this story today of this woman from Tyre, and in which Jesus is heading to. And so I don't have my clicker, sorry. So the next slide, sorry, Marty. I've only got a couple. But basically, just so you understand the context, Jesus has been teaching, doing all of these things in and around Galilee. And then he heads up along, you follow this red line, heads up to Tyre and Sidon. And that's where he goes, basically to retreat and be with his disciples, to get away from everyone. But as he goes there, as soon as he goes there, this woman hears that Jesus is there, and so she comes and falls at his feet. We find this same story in Matthew as well, in Matthew chapter 15. And there's actually more details in the Gospel of Matthew recorded about their interaction. But what we notice here is that this woman is in desperate need. It says in verse 25 that her little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit. In Matthew, it says that she was demon-possessed. And so this little girl is suffering terribly, which makes sense why her mum then suddenly hears the news and is desperate to go to Jesus. And as she comes to Jesus in this area, it says as soon as she heard about him, she went and sought him out and fell at his feet. And the things that this text says about this woman are really important for us to hear. Firstly, she's a Greek. That means she's outside of God's chosen people, the Jews. On top of that, she's born in Syrian Phoenicia, so she's a Canaanite. And if you know anything about your Old Testament, you would know that those people, the Canaanites, are about as far away from God as you can possibly get. And on top of this, she has a daughter who is suffering because she's possessed by a demon. And so this woman literally has everything against her. At first, it even seems like Jesus is against her. But he is doing something marvelous. In Matthew, there is stack more dialogue, and so she comes and begs Jesus for mercy, and yet he doesn't even acknowledge her in the first instance. The disciples get sort of wind of this, and so they are encouraged by Jesus' silence, and so they basically urge him to send her away, which I would interpret as them basically saying, Lord, do what she wants to get rid of her, right? Because they have never, up until this point, they've never seen someone come to Jesus in need and him not meet that need, right? So they would assume he was going to help her. And so when Jesus replies by saying, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel, I think he's actually addressing the disciples rather than her, keeping her at this point out of the conversation, seeming to exclude her completely. However, none of this stopped her from pressing on with her plea. She says, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. This is from Matthew's account. To which Jesus then addresses her directly, and he says in Mark 7:27, first let the children eat all they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, this seems right highly, highly offensive. The Jewish people are the children. Right, the Gentiles are the dogs. They were seen by the Jewish people as scavengers, filthy scavengers, unclean. But they were not seen that way by Jesus. Right? This is not an insult. Instead, what Jesus is doing, he's teaching a parable. He's speaking in parables and he's imagining a family meal in both gospel accounts. And the word that he uses here for dogs is the affectionate term or word which is better translated puppies. Right? And so he's talking about beloved pets. And so this is significant. It shifts this. And so as beloved pets, they will be fed. But dogs are not fed first, right? Jesus is saying that basically there is an order to my mission. I have come here to show the nation of Israel that I am the fulfillment of all that God has promised to Israel. And after the resurrection, the disciples are going to be sent out to make disciples of all people and all nations, and so fulfill the promise of Abraham that through him and his children, all people would be blessed. But not yet. Jesus is saying the Gentiles essentially just have to wait their turn. But how she responds to all of this is incredible. She replies, "Yes, Lord." Which is mind-blowingly significant. It's so easy to read that and skip over it. Because this is the only time in the whole Gospel of Mark that Jesus is addressed directly as Lord. You can look it up and check it out, make sure I'm not lying. The only time in the whole Gospel that someone sees him and says, "Lord." So get this, right? You have a woman with a demon-possessed daughter who's from a cursed nation who sees Jesus for who he really is. She hears a parable and she understands it, and she's not only understanding it, but she's not hardened by it. She's not blind. She's not deaf like all the other people, like the Pharisees, like the nation of Israel, like Jesus' own disciples. But instead, she has faith. Right? And so stop the music. This woman is the first example of someone who actually understands a parable and then rightly responds to it. No one else has understood Jesus' mission, that is come and what he's come to do. But she understands this after hearing one sentence in the form of a parable, and she doesn't argue. Instead, she says, "Yes, you are right. I don't have a seat at the table, but even the puppies get the crumbs." And so he says, "Because of your great faith," which Jesus has intentionally drawn out from her to show his disciples and to show us what faith looks like when one sees and hears and understands that Jesus is Lord. And so then from a distance, Jesus gives the word, and at that very moment, the demon leaves her daughter. How cool is that? How cool is that? You know, at the same time as all of this is happening, this is a foretaste of the reality that the Gentiles, all other people who are not Jews, will become recipients of God's grace and brought into the kingdom of God if they have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts to respond in faith like this woman has demonstrated. That's why he honours her. Because she actually stands up above the rest and has faith that Jesus is longing to see in the people of Israel, but is constantly left disappointed. This means that no one is so lost or so hopeless or so dirty or so unclean that Jesus can't break through and make them see. And often, in fact, it is those that the world overlooks or looks down on or sees as unclean and dirty or too far gone that have the heart underlying that Jesus is looking for. He holds up this woman as a model of faith, which we need to see. And so then he leaves Tyre, went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and the region of the Decapolis, which is right down the bottom there, right? The Sea of Galilee. So they essentially crossed over. And this area of the Decapolis is also known as the region of the 10 towns. The New Living Translation actually says that, which is also significant. Because if you remember, right, back in chapter 5, you might remember Jesus went on a field trip with his disciples, right? Got on a boat, did this field trip, went over, visited this region there, and was confronted by a demon-possessed guy who dwelt among the tombs. And he heals this guy, but the people there beg him to leave, and so he gets back on the boat, and as he's getting on the boat, the man runs up to him and he begs him, "Lord, let me go with you." But instead, Jesus says, "No, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, how he's had mercy on you." And it says that the man went away and immediately began to tell everyone in the Decapolis and or in the 10 towns, proclaiming the great things that Jesus had done for him. And here, right, you have Jesus arrive back there, and it seems like everyone suddenly knows about him. Why? Why would that be? I'll tell you why. Because this Gentile, demon-possessed man who was healed by Jesus has done exactly what Jesus asked him to do, and gone and told everyone in that whole area the awesome stuff that Jesus has done for him, how he's healed him, how he's had mercy on his life. And so now everyone knows. Oh, would we hear that for ourselves today? And do the same thing. Like, consider what Jesus does, what God does with one person's testimony, as they simply go and say, "This is what he has done for me." I really pray with all of my being that you are encouraged to do that today. You don't need to have all your theology straight. You don't need to know the Bible back to front. You just need to say, "This is what God has done for me." And by faith, lean into him and allow him to use that. Because here, all of these people heard about Jesus, and so they bring this deaf man to him who could hardly talk, and they beg Jesus just simply to touch him. And so Jesus takes this guy away from the crowds intentionally, right? Every moment, every interaction is intentional with Jesus. And so he takes this guy aside, he puts his fingers into the man's ear, and then he spits and touches the man's tongue, and he sighs deeply and says, "Be opened." So do you see what he is doing here? Do you see the significance of what Jesus is doing in the way that he is healing this man? Like, this is an object lesson, given how blind and hard-hearted the Pharisees are after constant miracles, after constant teaching that would reveal Jesus as the Messiah. And given that Jesus' own disciples can't yet hear and see who Jesus is, he is using this as an opportunity to make a point by healing this man this way, that God's own people, the nation of Israel, are spiritually blind and are spiritually deaf, while those who are seen as outsiders are the ones who actually see. How cool is that? Everything is intentional as Jesus brings this about. They are actually the ones who recognize him, which flows directly into Jesus feeding the 4,000, which is super similar to what he did in a chapter earlier when he fed 5,000. But the difference is that this feeding is likely done again in Gentile territory, very different to when he fed the 5,000. Which, like the Syrophoenician woman, reveals that Jesus is the bread of life, not only for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. And yet the disciples' hearts continue to remain hard. And so all this comes to a head because as they get on the boat to cross back over to the other side, have a read of this again. Mark chapter 8 from verse 14. It says the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. He's just fed 4,000, had all 7 basketfuls left over, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he says to them, do you still not understand? Do you still not understand? You know, we see in the disciples here a common trait that is true of all of us. You know, at times we either misunderstand or we forget. You know, Jesus makes a comment about leaven, and they, being self-conscious and insecure, think he's speaking about bread rather than the leaven of the Pharisees and that of Herod, which is essentially a figurative description of self-centeredness and self-reliance that leads to hard-heartedness and pride. That is what Jesus is warning them against. Beware of hard-heartedness. Beware of self-reliance. Beware of self-importance that leads to pride. And yet, they miss this still. And so he says, do you still not understand? He's essentially saying over and over again through what he's teaching and what he's doing, I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. I am. Can you not see it? Like, why be worrying and arguing about bread when I am in the boat with you? But their minds are dull and their hearts are hard. Now, at this point, I think it's super easy for us to look and to criticize the disciples. But do you ever doubt? I do. Are you living by faith right now? Are you living by faith like the Syrophoenician woman who, despite being initially dismissed, despite having everything against her, continues to press on and grab hold of the promise and persists until Jesus answers? Do you have faith like hers that pushes through obstacles and claims the promises that are hers in Jesus? You know, what are the insecurities that are causing you to doubt? And maybe you to question Jesus' goodness and his love or his power and his presence to work and move in your situation and in your world right now. What are those things that are going on in your world that cause you to become hard-hearted and proud rather than humble and faith-filled? To fall at the feet of Jesus and say, Lord, help me. Looking to him. Well, how many times I have forgotten the mercies of God. Forgotten how great his grace is to save me and to wash me and purify me and make me new And then not just make me new, but give me power and authority and fill me with his Spirit to then live a life of confidence and triumph that overcomes. Because that is who we are in Jesus. We are no longer slaves to sin. We have been set free. We overwhelmingly conquer in Jesus Christ, who has set us free. But we have a tendency to forget his blessing, to forget his previous work, how easily we, like the disciples, complain when something doesn't go our way, grumble and mumble and point fingers, or become frightened when those trials come. Can I ask the band to come? And it is because of this that we, just like the disciples, need the ongoing reminder to continue to trust him and to express faith in him and then walk in obedience to Jesus. To see him and hear him and be careful that our hearts don't become hard. Because I've seen that happen time and time and time again. As the devil comes in and sows these doubts and has a field day in his church. In his church. And so would we then be careful to pause, like to be still, to breathe in the breath of God and remind ourselves and remind one another of his goodness and his faithfulness, of who he is. And so pray for ourselves, pray for one another, that we have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts to respond humbly to him in faith. And so spur one another on to love and encourage one another and live out our faith in and through the challenges that come. But would we do it hand in hand? And so the question that this text has for us is really the same one that Jesus had for his own disciples. You have heard his words. You have seen his works. Do you not yet understand? Jesus has got this. Jesus has got you. Jesus has got you. He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Would we not be like those who don't believe, but instead express faith and trust in Jesus Christ, our King? Because he is just as at work today, in this world and in our lives individually, as he has ever been since the time that time began. And as such, he is our waymaker. He is our promise keeper. He is the light in the darkness. That is who he is. He is faithful. He is true. He is unchanging. And so today, right now, in this place, would you express faith and trust in him? Would you allow yourself to be led by the Spirit? Would you sit with an open posture and allow his Spirit to lead you and surrender afresh to him as King and as Lord right now in this moment? Maybe as simple as saying, Lord God, I need you. Come. Have your way in me. Would you renew your obedience to him and your trust in him as King of all? And would we sing this song and these words, not just with our lips, but with our whole hearts, with every ounce of our being, and pray them and proclaim them, not just for ourselves, but for those who are with us, and allow his Spirit to have his way in us, his church today.